Good evening, everyone. Good to see you here. Good evening, good evening. We are early, like I said, so we'll give people time to come in. Oh, nice. 2 pictures, huh? Good.
Then you know it's Christmas. The snow starts to fall. You know it's Christmas for the children above all. Then you know it's Christmas 'cause Santa's on his way.
I'll tell you, it's interesting about Max and Levon to see what's going to happen. Now, if we do a recap of chapter 15, if you remember, KO and Dr. Jeffries were babysitting the girls for the weekend. And her sister, KO's sister, Zelda, has been using his book, The Free Child, like a Bible. Everything about letting the kids basically teach themselves. No structure, just if they sleep when they're tired, they eat when they're hungry, so on and so on. And then KO wanted to set her friend up with his Wynn's father, and we saw how that turned out. So, big fight between those two. Her cat bit him, and I just want your opinion on some of the what do you think might happen now in chapter 16? Do you think we in 15 we learned that Dr. Jeffries couldn't tolerate the kids' behavior? He was tired, he was getting stressed out, his fatigue was starting to show, and KO caught on to all this. And of course, it put a smile on her face. All right. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of Christmas music. And we are going to get started here pretty soon. So, hi, Mary Jo. Hello, Lori's Creations. Hello, everyone. So, on to recap chapter 15. I don't know if, now this is my theory, I don't know if Dr. Jeffries is going to admit to KO that the kid's running amok, throwing food out of the freezer onto the floor, dunking his good gold pen in the bowl, using his razor to shave the dogs. Absolutely no control. So I'm kind of wondering, is he going to admit that to KO? I don't think so, but we're going to find out. So I'm thinking because we were with KO and Dr. Wynn Jeffries during chapter 15, I'm hoping as we go in to chapter 16, we will learn what is happening between Max, Dr. Jeffries' father, and KO. So that's going to be very interesting. It is almost 9 o'clock. Let's get started. But don't be afraid to put your opinions in the comments. Tell me what you think might happen, or how do you feel about the free child and things like that. I think that would be very interesting to know. I got a gnat that came in my room. Get out of here, little gnat. I'd like to see what other people think about that. Yes, they do. Absolutely, Mary Jo. Children do need those boundaries. They crave discipline. They crave direction. Because really, without direction, they would feel unloved. So I'm just really confused here with Dr. Jeffrey's theories on child rearing. And we're going to find out. But I think this chapter, I don't know, we'll see about Max and Lavon, since they weren't in the last chapter, but some of it was about them. For I usually try to just go 1 or 2 pages in to do the sneak peek. I don't want to go too far in. I want to know what's happening when you guys know what's happening. So I try not to go too many pages in. 2 hours later, at 10:30, both Zoe and Zara were in their beds and asleep. This was no small accomplishment. After a half dozen stories, the girls were finally down for the night. Ko tiptoed out of the room as quietly as possible, closed the door, and Win was just ahead of her and looked as exhausted as she felt. Zero recognized Ko forlornly from the hallway. The poor dog had been almost completely shaved. He stared up at her, hairless and shivering. Zorro still had his hair. The Yorkshire Terrier's left side had been sheared before Ko razor out of her niece's hand. Last winter, Zelda had knit tiny dog sweaters, which Ko found, and with Win's help slipped over the 2 terriers. At least they'd be warm. Although neither dog seemed especially grateful, Ko sank down on the sofa beside Win, with the dogs nestled at their feet. Breathing out a long, deep sigh, she gazed up at the ceiling. Win was curiously quiet. I feel like going to bed myself, she murmured, when she recovered enough energy to speak. What time sister and brother-in-law supposed to return? Win asked, with what seemed to require an extraordinary amount of effort. Zelda said they should be home by 3. That late? Ko couldn't keep the grin off her face. It was just as she hoped. She wouldn't have to argue about the problem with his free child theories, since he had been able to witness for himself the havoc they caused. Straightening, Ko suggested they listen to some more music. That won't disturb them, will it? He asked. When she got up to put on another CD, evidently he had no interest in anything that might wake the girls. I should hope not. She found the Christmas CD she'd given to Zelda 2 years earlier and inserted it into the player. It featured a number of pop artists. Smiling over at Win, she lowered the volume. John Denver's voice reached softly into the room, singing Joy to the World. Win turned off the floor lamp. The illumination came from the Christmas lights, tree lights. The mood was cheerful and yet relaxed. For the first time in days, they were alone. The incident with Win's father and the demands of the twins were the last things on Ko's mind. Win placed his arm across the back of the sofa, and she sat close to him, resting her head against his shoulder. All they needed now was a glass of wine and a kiss or two. Romance swirled through the room with the music and Christmas lights. Wynn must have felt it too, because her into his arms and Ko started to close her eyes, anticipating his kiss. When she caught a movement from the corner of her eye, she gasped. A mouse, a rodent, ran across the floor. Instantly alarmed, Ko jerked away from Wen. He bolted upright. What is it? A mouse. She hated mice. There, she cried, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. She pointed at the rodent scampering under the Christmas tree. Wen leaped. I see it. Apparently, so did Zero, because he let out a yelp and hit the tree. Zorro followed. Ko brought both feet onto the sofa and hugged her knees. It was completely unreasonable and so cliche to be terrified of a little mouse. But she was. Well, logic told her a mouse was harmless. That knowledge didn't help. You have to get it out of here, she whimpered as panic set in. I'll catch it, shouted, and dived under the Christmas tree, toppling it over. The tree slammed against the floor, shattering several of the bulbs. Ornaments rolled in all directions. The dogs ran for cover. Fortunately, the tree was still plugged in because it offered what little light was available. Unable to watch chaos, she wondered what Wynn would do if he managed to corner the rodent. The thought of him killing it right there in her sister's living room was intolerable. Kill it, she insisted, and raised her hands from her eyes to find Wynn on his hands and knees staring at her. The mouse darted across the floor, raced under the sofa, where Ko just happened to be sitting. Zero and Zorro ran after it, yelping frantically. Ko screeched and scrambled to a standing position on the sofa. Not knowing what else to do, she bounced from one cushion to the other. Zero had buried his nose as far as it would go under the sofa. Zorro dashed back and forth on the carpet. As hard as she tried, Ko couldn't keep still and began hopping up and down, crying out in abject terror. She didn't care if she woke the girls or not. There was a mouse directly beneath her feet, somewhere. For all she knew, it could have crawled onto the sofa itself. That thought made her jump from the sofa over the rest and onto the floor, narrowly missing Zero. The lamp fell. She was able to catch it, seconds before it crashed to the floor. As she righted the lamp, she flipped it on, provided a welcome circle of light. Meanwhile, Anilo crooned out the 12 days of Christmas. Still on all floors, Wind crept around the carpet to the sofa, which he overturned. As it pitched onto its back, the mouse shot out directly at Ko. She screamed, Zero yelped, and Zorro tore fearlessly after it. Ko screamed again and grabbed a basket in which Zelda kept her knitting. She emptied the basket and more of, by instinct than anything else, flung it over the mouse, trapping him. Wind sat up with a shocked look. You got him! Both dogs stood guard by the basket, sniffing at the edges, and Zero scratched the carpet. Zelda's yarn and needles were a tangled mess on the floor, but seemed intact. Breathless, Zero stared at the basket, not knowing what to do next. It had a brown tail, she commented. Wynn nodded. I noticed that too. I'm beginning to wonder if the girls didn't have a mouse. You know what I'm saying? With all the chaos in that house, I just wonder. Oh, it's so good, Lori. You will love them. I've never seen a mouse with a brown tail before. African brown-tailed mouse, he said, sounding knowledgeable. I saw a documentary on them. African mice are here in the States. She wondered if animal control knew about this. He nodded again. So I gather. What do we do now? Because to know more about this sort of thing, she looked to him for the answer. Kill it, he said without a... Zero and Zorro obviously agreed, because they both growled and clawed at the carpet, asking for the opportunity to do it themselves. No, Teo objected. She couldn't allow him to kill it. The terriers either. Although mice terrified her, Ko couldn't bear to hurt any of God's creatures. All I want you to do is get that brown-tailed mouse out of here. As soon as Zelda returned, Ko planned to suggest she call a pest control company to inspect the entire house. Although, if there were other mice around, she didn't want to know it. All right, Wynn muttered. I'll outside and release it. He got a newspaper and knelt down next to the dogs. Carefully, inch by inch, he slid the paper beneath the upended basket. When he finished that, he stood and carried the whole thing to the front door. Zero and Zorro followed, leaping up on their hind legs and barking wildly. Ko hurried to open first the door and then the screen. The cold air felt good against her heated face. Wind stepped onto the porch while Ko held back the dogs by closing the screen. They both objected strenuously and braced their front paws against the door, watching Wynn's every movement. I'm going to take a short drink right here. Ko turned her back as Wynn released the African brown-tailed mouse into the great unknown. She wished the critter a pleasant life outside. It's gone, she asked when Wynn came back into the house, careful to keep Zero and Zorro from escaping and racing after the varmint. It's gone, and I didn't even need to touch it, he assured her. He closed the door. Ko smiled up at him. My hero, she whispered. Wynn playfully flexed his muscles. Anything else I can do for you, my fair damsel? Looping her arms around his neck, Ko backed him up against the front door and rewarded him with a warm, tender kiss. Wynn wrapped his arms about her waist and half lifted her on the carpet. You are my hero, she whispered between kisses. You saved me from the killer mouse, the African brown-tailed killer rat. It was a rat, a small one, murmured, and kissed her again before she could ask more questions. A baby rat. That meant there must be parents around, and possibly, perhaps, any number of other rats. What makes you think it was a rat? She demanded, fast losing interest in kissing. He was fat, but perhaps he was just a fat mouse. Ah, you're still grateful, very grateful, but... He kissed her again, then abruptly broke off the kiss. His eyes seemed to focus on something across the room. Ko tensed, afraid he had seen another mouse, or rat, or rodent, or some descriptions of the thing. It took genuine courage to glance over her shoulder, but she did it anyway. Fortunately, she didn't see anything other than an overturned Christmas tree, scattered furniture, and general chaos brought about by the great brown-tailed mouse hunt. "The fishbowl has blue water," he said. "Blue water?" K.O. dropped her arms and stared at the counter between the kitchen and the living room, where the fishbowl sat. Sure enough, the water was a deep blue. Wynn walked across the room. Before K.O. could ask what he was doing, Wynn pushed up his sweater and thrust his hand into the water. "Just as I thought," he muttered, retrieving a gold pen. After she found the twins with Wynn's electric shaver, she realized they had opened his overnight case. "This is a gold fountain pen," he told her, holding up the dripping pen. "As it happens, this is a valuable gold fountain pen." "With blue ink," K.O. added. She didn't think it could be too valuable since it was leaking. She picked up the bowl with both hands and carried it into the kitchen, setting it in the sink. Scooping out the 2 goldfish, she put them in a temporary home, a coffee cup filled with fresh, clean water, and refilled the bowl. Seems to me that she was being a little, snarly with him about saying, it can't be too valuable if it's dripping and leaking. Well, of course it's leaking. It sat in a fish bowl. Wynn was pacing the kitchen floor behind her. "Does your book say anything about situations like this?" She couldn't resist asking. He glared at her, and apparently that was all the answer he intended to give. "Aunt Catherine," one of the twins shouted. "Come quick." K.O. heard unmistakable panic in the little girl's voice. Soon the 2 girls, both crying out, hurrying into the bedroom with Wynn right behind her. K.O. and Zara weeping loudly. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Freddie's gone," Zoe wailed. "Freddie?" she repeated. "Who's Freddie?" "Our hamster," Zoe explained, pointing at what K.O. now recognized as a cage against the far wall. He must have figured out how to open his cage. A chill went through her.